Hey everyone. There's always a problem with doing the talk after lunch because either people are going to show up late or they're going to fall asleep because of the cookies. So either one's fine with me. I'm here because I'm enamored with the sound of my own voice. The fact that you guys can get some benefit out of it is awesome. As the slide says, I'm Shawn Wildermuth. I run a little consulting company in Atlanta, and I'm here to talk about minimal APIs. I want to get a sense first of where people are at. There's a lot of bright lights, so I won't be able to see super well. But how many people are doing ASP.NET Core? Let's start there. About half. And how many of those are using minimal APIs? Well, then you're hopefully going to learn a lot, because no one is doing it. One person has sort of halfway. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what minimal APIs are, but we're going to spend most of our time in code, which is sort of the way I like to teach. First, I'll tell you who I am. In case you don't know, I'm a Pluralsight author, I'm a YouTuber, and I'm a filmmaker. And on the side, I run a consulting business in Atlanta. So minimal APIs without controllers. This is something I think the team has wanted to do for a long time. Now, MVC architecture or MVC APIs, or web APIs as we used to call them, was a big change from the way we wanted to do APIs earlier with like SOAP. Anyone remember SOAP? Okay, you're all as old as I am. That's good. And it was a huge step forward, but it still relied on a lot of plumbing to make it work. There's a lot of convention-based things. And for things like microservices, microarchitectures, the team wanted something even simpler, something with less plumbing, something that was just individual units of work as a single API, without it necessarily having to do with having a class that represented them. Now, the ideas around having a class that represented them continues to be not a bad idea for a lot of situations, but I'm going to sort of talk through how we started, and then I'm going to show you some tools I use to make organizing them a little better. The overarching idea here that I think is important is that what I'm going to show you isn't the right way or the best practice. It's simply to tell you that it's going to be up to you to figure out how to structure them for your application. And that, I think, is an important idea. When you look at different people that talk on the subject of APIs or of server-side.NET, there's a lot of different opinions about how we want to organize our code, whether they're in like feature sets or whether they're in modules. And minimal APIs I really like because they don't really care which way you want to do it. You can, there isn't a right or wrong way. So for the architecture you're building, you can really make it work. So even though minimal APIs don't require you to have something like a controller sort of mechanism, it's still pretty common to use controller-like or classes to group APIs together. And we'll see some ways that are called minimal API groups a little later. But this does mean that you're going to be responsible for that organization. And if you're already using controllers and you're happy with them, it's very hard for me to go to those brownfield applications and move them all. There is a performance benefit with minimal APIs over controllers. Is it perceivable? Probably not. Most of the time, when people are like, I want minimal APIs because they're faster, I'm like, if you want it to be faster, why don't you go look at your queries first? Or go look at the 14 layers of business logic you're walking through first. Because the speed increase of minimal APIs over controllers isn't enough that you're going to make your SQL queries any faster. You're just not going to really notice it in the end. So it's more for architectural reasons why. So if you're using controllers or you're comfortable with controllers and you're happy with controllers, I'm not here to say you don't need to, but I came into minimal APIs a bit skeptical, as is sort of my nature. I suffer from, I don't like when people move my cheese. Like, the new thing is always the worst idea ever. And then I go, oh, that's kind of better. And then sort of the tail end is like, oh, okay, this is why I don't love it, but it's fine. And that's sort of where I'm at with minimal APIs, though most of the projects I work on these days use minimal APIs instead of controllers. So that's all the slides. I will be happy to give you the slides at the end of the talk, but let's look at some code. Now here's the question of whether this is going to be big enough. Come on, how many of these do I have open? So I've got a project here. It's a project that you can get out in GitHub called Shoe Money API, or Shoe Money is the project. It's a simple example of a shoe store e-commerce site. And I don't have any APIs yet, but I have defined them. One of my philosophies around APIs is you need to design them first. And I end up with HTTP files of what my API should look like. Like in this case, for products, we don't have any posts or puts or deletes because I'm just getting a static catalog out there. And so I'm going to start here and talk about how I would implement these. This is sort of the pattern that I use for developing APIs these days. You'll see things like in the orders, this is much more complex. It has posts and puts and deletes, the sort of CRUD things you're used to. And so let's implement this first one, the easiest of all APIs. Oh, that's why it looks so weird. Oh, that's so much better. So I'm going to just start in program.cs. This has a bunch of stuff in here about setting up my database and things like that, but we're going to ignore all that. I'm going to come down here right before run, and I'm going to create a map get. This is the minimal API. I can go directly and say, go ahead and map the specific verb to the specific piece of code I'm running. So if I say API foo, I've now created an API, right? Probably not the best API in the world, but if we run this, come on. This is going to crash at some point. I just didn't want it to be the first time I ran it. So let's come over here back to the products, and I'm just going to say, I'm going to do all my examples here in HTTP files. If you want to know more about those, I have a video on them, but I'm not going to belabor. Basically just constructing actual requests. Woo, right? You can see that it's foo. And so at a high level, this seems like, I say at a high level, this is a pretty low level. This is make a request, and I'm going to do something to return something that the API wants. Now, the magic here for me is that instead of just returning some data, of course, I'm going to want a little bit of logic here. And the dependency injection happens in these lambdas. So I can just say shoe context. That was a test and all of you failed. Context.products to list, right? This should be a lot better, but this is where we're at right now. Let's rebuild. That's better. Really? What did I do? Oh, I left it as foo. Again, you guys, I don't know if you understand how this works. How many of you do pair programming? Well, this is pair programming with 100 of my closest friends. And just as effective. There's a lot of data here, so it takes a little to show it, right? And so the kind of things I'm doing are the same sort of pieces of code that I would write anywhere. And if you've done controllers, it's a very similar idea. So here, instead of just returning the products, like that would never do, is we're going to say get the result. And I could do try catch, but I'm just going to do it this way. If result.length .count is, then I can return results. Wow, my typing's bad today. Bad request, return results.ok, result. Right? Yeah. My least favorite part of the entire system right now. And so we can do those little tricks of the same sort of code we might be used to. And this implies something. This implies that this lambda is sort of single use. Nope, that's not what I wanted. But this is just as happy to take methods, right? So I could have a get result. Come on. Get products. Just get rid of the arrow piece. And say get products. And what's interesting, what doesn't it look here? Oh, stop suggesting stuff. And so for me, what's interesting here is that it becomes this sort of wiring up versus actual implementation. Now, this is fine until your program.cs, which I've seen in production code, starts to look like that, right? You have this already main place where you already have a lot of these operations in. It's more a matter of how do you structure them. And my solution, for good or for bad, is to actually create API classes. So I'm just going to create a new object I call products API, for lack of a better name. What you call it doesn't matter. This is just the way I sort of approach it. And let's take this, and I'm going to make it a member of a class. In fact, I'm going to make it a static, member of the class, because it's not really sharing any information. It's a single instance that does the same thing over and over again. And we'll talk about in a second why I think that's so useful. And let's go ahead and use a constructor. Now let's create a public register method. Well, actually, before we do that, yeah, this is fine. I'll take the same code for my API here, and I'll put it here. Of course, we need the app, and the app, of course, is a web application. So let's get rid of all of this. And that continues to work, right? If I don't misspell app. Shawn. And this should continue to work, right? Now that seems not incredibly helpful, because all I've done is sort of moved it into this other place. Just make sure it still works. And so what am I really accomplishing here? One of the things that is .NET 7 and later, so if you're still in .NET 6, you won't be able to use this. Hopefully by now you're not, since it's almost out of support, is groups. Map group, API product, or products. And then each of these that we could create are going to have just the extension. If you've done controllers, you know that this is just like putting the route on the class instead of the object. This is remarkably free of attributes, which I don't mind either, though you can use attributes in some cases to do things like hint parameters and things like that. But this makes it a little simpler. Now, a lot of the things you're used to doing are now fluent syntaxes. So saying require authorization instead of having an auth tag, for instance. Now, the underlying plumbing still works. You could put an authorization on this object and it will still work. So you can really do it in either way. One of the reasons I like this is it's much more common for me to go require authorization on the group and maybe allow anonymous on the individual ones, right? And this extends that these are going to be a lot of the things you need to do to wire in, because it's essentially a set of middleware that you can define in these different pieces to be handled before your code is actually executed, or before and after. And so writing these is really incredibly simple for how you would add services to the code. And we're going to talk about validation in a minute. But I have a real problem, because one of the things you might have noticed here is I'm not using dependency injection except for the actual method injection. I'm not using property. I'm not registering this class as a dependency. The reason is because it is only used once. We create an instance, we register these, and then it goes away, right? Of course, there's a closure to the actual methods being stored so it can execute them when the routes are called. But the actual class doesn't need dependency injection. And so one of the first things I tried, oops, wrong namespace. One of the first things I tried was to just take this and add an interface that I called at the time IAPI. So API just defines that we have a register function so I could more easily see these, right? And so let's, well, I'll get to that in a minute. And this API would allow me to go look for all of the things that have IAPI in the system, call register on them because they all support the IAPI, and we're good to go. And that's all boilerplate that I didn't want to have to write multiple times. So I came up with something called minimal API discovery, which, because of our internet, I pre-included. Oops. So you see here a minimal API discovery package that you can get. And all this really does is defines this interface for us. If we look at the interface, it literally is just pass in iRoute builder, which is a base class that allows it to be used in a couple of other places. And it's complaining because this is not an iRoute builder. course, it puts it on the bottom. But effectively the same thing, right? Now, how do I actually call these? This is the point that I think is interesting and helps me make this a little more simpler. So I don't want to have to deal with this anymore. I don't want to create the products and then register them. And I can actually just say app dot map APIs. Nope. Always my biggest fear. And this does that work of looking for the interface and then registering for me. But in this case, it's using a code generator. Code generator is just creating code at runtime instead of doing a reflection creating code at compile time instead of creating using reflection at runtime. But in this way, anything that has that API interface, we're going to call and have those things registered. Now, I've almost rebuilt all of controllers at this point, right? Pretty close. The real piece that for me, where this clicked as a way to do things new that I abandoned, were tests. Because in my products, if I make these public, wow. Then suddenly I can instantiate these and run tests against them, right? I don't have to have the plumbing of all the things required to do integration tests with controllers. Create a fake web server, inject all the things into the server, ask for the controller out, and then call that method, right? This means that the tests for my APIs that I write, the unit tests for these APIs, become a whole lot simpler. Sure, I may need to construct a mock version of, in this case, context, but I'm able to pass in all the things that I can simply mock or get known instances of and just call them. They're just methods. There's nothing magical here. There's no plumbing here, really. And to me, that's a big part of why I like the way this works. Now, one of the things, let me take these off because obviously these are going to break everything. Let's go ahead and run it just to prove our point. Still works. And then what do we do in here? We have the second method that we need. And so I'm going to say get products. Actually, in this case, I'm not going to create a new one. I'm actually going to add some parameters, right? I'm going to need a page size. And let's say page equals 1. I'm actually going to reverse these. And then, of course, I can just here say skip page -1, take page size. Restart it. And what we're going to get, obviously, is should be a much smaller version that only has 25 entries. And when I call it with page parameters like, let's say, 3 or 13, we're going to get those that piece of data as well. And so again, if you've done controllers, this should be no different to you. You've probably seen this in a bunch of places. So it's important to note that here in the code here, this is still the same thing. So if I want to actually implement get product, right? It's still going to do the same sort of mapping, parameterization of that route. And so what you're seeing here is that we're using the same sort of semantics that we probably already know, but in this much thinner sort of veneer, so that there's less plumbing going on. There isn't a bunch of interfaces that need to be registered for the project. And I'll just go ahead and implement this real quick, just so we have it complete. And what I'm looking for. Because it doesn't know what the interfaces are or the things that it needs, HTTP context is the minimum that you need in order to do this. So let me go public I result. Where it is really hating me today. I know some people say first or default is a code smell, but for our simple example here, I think it'll be okay. Right? And of course, we need our weight here. Yes, stop. Why doesn't it like that? Thought that's what I had a second ago. I must have had an extra letter. And when we run this, we should be able to get the individual products as well. No big surprise, right? So all this is, the same sort of thing you would be used to getting. Oh, good, there's a product 100. I knew I should have made it 1,000,000. So there's a couple of things that we can talk about further about it. But what I want you to get at is minimal APIs are really shooting for this very simple way to do things. Without really reinventing how you do business logic. And so if you're doing controllers today and you think, I want to convert this all, you can, because really what's in between the curly braces isn't any different. And even if you wanted to, one of the differences you'll see is in the API, we're using result.ok, results.badRequest, and you might be used to just having a base class to do that. There's actually a little trick that I usually do as well. Which is, wow, those are really spaced out. Using static results. Fully qualify it. So that I can just get rid of these now. Make sense? See, you really can accomplish the same things in the same way without a lot of difference in the way you want to do things. Now, you could do all these as lambdas. There's no wrong reason to do that. I just create individual static classes so that I can test them. That's really the only difference in breaking them out. Also, there's a messiness to having long lambdas in between all of the pieces to where this register becomes this enormous mess of code that I don't really like either. So again, the benefits of it. So let's talk about one other piece. And that is validation. So inside my project, I have some validators: address, order item, and an order validator. And these are just Fluent validation validators in the simplest way. And one of the things that I missed was the sort of automatic validation that happened when using Fluent validation and the base classes that would call those validators. And there is an interesting notion here, and that is these can be called, I'm actually using another class, another project I built called Minimal APIs Fluent Validation that is a really simple, small little project. But let's go back to our API. And if I was going to have a post, because obviously validating on the get is possible, but it's not really useful. And what this extension has really done is just say validate. Well, let me show you what it's actually using. You'll see down here, it's probably really hard to see in the back, but there's an add endpoint filter and an add endpoint filter factory. These are the ways that you can inject into the pipeline of this call with basically something that's going to do some specific things. Some people use this for custom authorization. I've used it to create validate, let's say order, because I don't have one for product. Let's bring in the entity and using minimal. Bring in the Fluent validation. And now we can just call validate order. What doesn't it like here? Sure it does. Say that again? Yeah, I don't think that's the reason it's complaining, but let's see. Stop debugging. Pretty sure it's because it didn't rebuild. Right? Okay, what did I do? There it is. This is always my favorite part, when I forgot how I did it. Validate should be fine. Call it with validation? No. Well, that's embarrassing. That's very strange. So it's complaining about the create, but why did my validate disappear? Make sure I added the right one. Say that again?
You said, do you have a finished solution we can look at?
Yeah. Yes, I do. Good idea. It's so finished. Doesn't work in the non-preview. Come on. Really, Visual Studio? Let's do it this way since it doesn't know why it doesn't want to open. Projects. Of course, now it opened. If you go clockwise, sometimes it speeds it up. I don't know if you know that. Just don't go backwards. Well, that's a bad sign. Video Studio installer is getting involved. I don't know if any of you have seen me talk before, but I used to know what I was doing. When in doubt. Let's go over to the orders API. And what you'll see here is that I'm able to call validate order. I know. Validate order when I create the puts and what it will effectively do is look for our validators in the common. Now, this implies that I know about the validation. So Fluent Validation has its own ideas about how to register validators into dependency injection. So I don't have to do any of that. I'm really just resolving them from the service collection, executing them, and returning the correct thing, which is a problem result from those validators. My goal, ultimately, is that it be this simple, right? Of course, it's complaining about it as well, but we'll have to figure that out later. I must have changed the namespace when I updated it a couple days ago. But this implies that you can do cross-cutting things into your minimal APIs that you might have done with filters before, because they're called endpoint filters instead. So are there things that minimal API is missing? Perhaps. But it's doing a lot of the things in the same way that you might be used to, just not as magically. One of the reasons they're so minimal is they want, instead of saying add controllers and that magically go find all your controllers, that you want to think about the way you want to register these things. But it also means you can decide for different deployments of a single project not to register all the endpoints, right? Because you're making these decisions at runtime to register them, and it gives you that flexibility. So minimal APIs, in their very nature, are that simple, right? You'll see in this example, which I don't really discuss others, that if you're using something like Swagger Open API, it does the same sort of things that you're used to, again, with extension methods to describe and document your APIs and create the Swagger doc and all that lovely things that we know that we want from most projects. Any questions about this? I could not have been that clear. Over here?
So I'm just wondering if you have a conventional controller API that has classes injected into it, would anything change in this scenario? Does that make sense?
Yeah, so the question was about if you're using controllers where you're injecting these things at the class level, whether this changes anything really. Do I have that right?
Yeah.
It doesn't. You can actually have your classes injected into dependency injection and use them at the class level if you want to. Like, that's still available to you. I don't find it as useful because usually individual calls to an API only need a subset of the things that the class might need. And this is always one of my complaints about controllers, is controller constructors had 14 different injectors that I'm using 2 or 3 in each of the APIs I need for particular needs. And that's what I was really trying to get across. Now, some people want to think of these as more commands, and so I've had some people approach me about creating one class per API, not per per API and per verb. And if that's useful to you, this allows that as well. But the idea of doing a method injection, which I think is something they either have brought or are thinking of bringing to minimal APIs, to controller-based APIs, I think it's just cleaner. Sure, the context or the repository or the business object or whatever you normally inject that everybody uses, you're going to be duplicating, but I'm not as concerned about that. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question? It doesn't have to have. Did that answer your question?
Well, I guess for your sake, we want to try to get away from using things typically. I guess I'm starting to get a little confused. I guess I'm used to like having the controller layer and then the service layer and the database layer. So the database stuff connects to the server and the server to the controller. So are we on the same page?
We are. Now, in this example, I'm using straight context, but this would be whatever object you normally relay it to. Like in one of my clients' projects, basically all it does is call their business layer and say return, right? What's inside here isn't that big a deal. You're still going to be using dependency injection in a hierarchical way. It's just a matter of how you're wiring these up. Because for the most part, like you say, the APIs themselves should be pretty thin. You shouldn't be doing these individual things. The only case where I think the APIs should be more responsible of, and that is dealing with status codes. So returning an OK in every case, and some of those cases have an error object in them, I'm less thrilled with. But normally I wrap that into some useful wrapper that each of the methods call as well. And so these should just be plumbing, not business logic, even though in this very thin example, the small example, I'm not doing that, but normally I would. Normally I would. Other questions? Well, one of the troubles with minimal APIs that I want to talk about is that there's not a lot to them, and so I always run early on this talk. More my problem than your problem. But is there anything around minimal APIs you guys are still curious about, or you want to contend that we should be using controllers? We can have that conversation. We'll start over here.
Other than speed, is there a real reason to use them?
So other than speed, is there a real reason to use them? Just architecturally, I find them easier to work with, easier to change into different architectures. I mean, controllers allow you to put controllers anywhere. They no longer need to be in the magic controller directory. So you get some of that benefit anyway. And again, speed isn't the reason to use them. To me, it's about each method is really a unit of work that has everything to know about it. Like not having to know about the classes it's contained in, to me, is a benefit. And these could all be, lambdas. They don't have to have class structures. The big reason I use this pattern specifically is testing. Because testing controllers is annoyingly complicated. It's boilerplate, you do it once, you don't have to think about it. But being able to call the API code directly, to me, is a big win for testing. But if that's not important to you, then... Question here. Did that answer your question?
Yes. Would you find any benefit into utilizing like native AOT with minimal APIs?
So the question is, would you gain any benefit using native AOT? Probably. I mean, I don't have I don't have a black and white answer for that. One of the reasons I built the discovery piece using CodeGen was specifically for AOT, for scenarios where you needed to do ahead of time compilation. There's nothing in Minimal API that prevents it. It's usually your code that uses reflection or something like that that causes AOT to not work. And there's a surprising amount of reflection in the framework. So it's so convenient that it happens to break that. So you're seeing more and more things move to CodeGen. And at some point, CodeGen will be so slow we'll go back to reflection for compile time speed. But that's just the nature of the beast. Other questions? Trying to see if I can see the back row in case anyone does. Well, if not, I appreciate this. Let me just show you the last slide so you know where to get the slides and demos. I will be in the Discord server answering questions. Where's I picked the wrong one? I probably stopped it. So the official docs are there. I have some videos detailing a lot of how this works on YouTube. And if you go to wildermuth.com, which is my blog, you'll be able to get the slides and demo code as well. So thanks for coming.